Sir, we are live.
Hello and welcome to Navigating Data Gaps, Journalism Practices in the 21st Century. Joining me today, and this is the part that gives me great pleasure when I'm introducing people, Govindraj Athiraj, Managing Trustee, IndiaSpend. Now, Govindraj is a television and print journalist, but he has always been ahead of the curve. He was founder of IndiaSpend, which then started Fact Checker and Boom, which means the two big blocks of journalism really. One is data and the other is fact checking. And Govind was the pioneer in that. So, and he's been a business journalist. And I was telling just before the show that Govind and I probably traversed this terrain more or less for the same amount of time, which is a quarter of a century, I think, long now. So lovely to have you, Govind, with us. We have Shreya Khaitan. She's a writer and editor at IndiaSpend, and her work mostly has been in the area of tuberculosis and education, and she's actually worked in a number of places, which is very interesting to me. She also worked in education and childhood development organizations in Washington, D.C., India, and Jordan. Welcome, Shreya, from IndiaSpend. Rukmini, my old friend, and Rukmini S, as many of you would know her, is actually, I would say, India's first data journalist in the newsroom. In fact, she's the first one that I saw who was doing data, who seriously pursued data journalism as a career in mainstream newspapers. Till then, we did not have data journalists. In the newsroom I worked, we did not have data journalists at all. So, and Rukmini has been a journalist, of course, from 2004, it's been a long time. But now, and 2013 is when she became the national data editor. But what I want to say, and to the viewers, that in 2 days, Rukmini's book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, is going to be at your stores. Please go and buy this. It promises to fly off the shelves. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not selling. You must read Rukmini. And Rukmini, thank you for coming back to JSJC data programs. We've had you last time also with Steve Doig. And Ruchira, my colleague who teaches data analysis for storytelling and introduction to data journalism, who has a PhD in economics. And her work has been largely in the area of gender. She's done her research on dowry, unpaid work, but most importantly, in today's context, I must thank Ruchira for this alliance. Ruchira Sen and Uttaran Das Gupta, both faculty at the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication, have been responsible for this collaboration and this. Now, why are we here? So let me begin by doing the honors. I'm holding up the MOU between IndiaSpend, which is India's first data journalism portal, and JSJC, India's first global media school. And Govind can fact check both. And I think it's very exciting because it's not just an MOU for the other kind of MOUs that we sign on behalf of the university, but this is for research and investigations that we want to do in a collaborative way. So now let me just dive straight into the questions. We will hopefully have time for a question and answer session towards the end. So please do type your questions on the YouTube box, and those questions are going to be conveyed to me, and I'm going to put them to respective people. So if I may start with Govind, since you're the founder and in a way introduced us to data in a big way. What is data, Govind? It's the most fundamental question. What is big data? I don't think so most of us, or a lot of us, really understand. I mean, we understand there's a buzzword, very nice it sounds like, but what is big data? And since, from IndiaSpend, you also started off the boom live, and fact checker came before that, sorry. How do you verify data? And I'll give you a case in point. 37 years ago, one of the worst post-Indian massacres happened in Assam, which was the Nelly massacre. Hundreds of pieces have been written. Maybe not hundreds, actually hundreds should have been written. Not so much have been written. I have visited that, written over that time and again, others have. People have witnessed it in a way. Even people who were witnessing it obviously couldn't count the dead. Now, this is just 40 kilometers from Guwahati on the highway. So it is not exactly a remote place. So there was a police station, there were journalists, there was a videographer from ABC. And we still don't know how many people died. The government says 1,300, someone says 1,800. I say 3,000. I mean, there is no way to figure out how many people have died there. So how do you verify data? If I can start with you.
Kishle, thank you very much for joining me. And you, in many ways, jumped straight into the core of the problem without allowing people like me to first hide behind, let's say, the broader, descriptions which I usually do. But and I really would defer to my colleagues and friends, Rukmini and Shreya, on to use examples to illustrate exactly what you're saying. But let me give you a couple of definitional points from my vantage point, at least. So we as IndiaSpend use data to tell stories, and we do that in public interest. We focus on areas like health, education, environment, and gender, or issues at the intersection of some of these. So if you were to take, let's say, something like air quality, that's at the intersection of health and environment. And what's the biggest challenge you face today, or could be the biggest challenge you face today? It is that there is not enough data available on what air quality levels are like. Now, there is a lot of data available now, as opposed to, let's say, 4 years ago, about air quality in Delhi. But there too, I think if you were to go really granular, if you were to be a resident of Delhi, you would quite likely find places which are not covered. Secondly, you will find places that are very well covered, but those are traffic signals and traffic junctions where the monitoring stations are. And from my understanding of from people who are in this space, even if you're literally 50 meters away, then your readings could be completely wrong. So, if you're trying to understand, am I living in a really polluted area or not, and how polluted is it really, then I don't have the best data necessarily to take that decision, even at my own level. Let's forget writing articles and making it into a public policy issue. So that is one illustration. Let me give you another illustration before I even attempt what the point that you were raising. What's the biggest, perhaps, data question that we are asking today, right now, as we all gather around here? How many people in India have Omicron, right? Or have been are likely to have Omicron? I spoke to a virologist yesterday who says that you're essentially you're essentially smoking something if you think that a lot of people in India don't have Omicron, which means that a lot of people already have it here. The only thing is we haven't discovered it. Now, is that a problem of data collection? Is that a problem of data collection and then taking it onward for sequencing, or is it some other problem to do with logistics rather than anything else? Or could it be to do with testing or cost, or why people turn up for testing or not? So it could be many more reasons. And again, I think Rukmini, for instance, has written extensively on it. I'm sure she can articulate. But it is right now what we are faced with is a gap. We don't know how many people are there. There is a sense of panic all around us, not just in India, but all around the world. And everyone is waiting on tenterhooks to know what is going to come out of those studies by those scientists and doctors to tell us whether we are really protected or as we were against previous variants or not. So that's another data gap. So and these are data gaps, air quality, Omicron, strain presence, which are to do with our world around us, what we look around, what we breathe, literally, and so on. Then there are other data gaps which are to do with the areas like, let's say, jobs, unemployment, GDP data. So these are slightly longer term. If you don't know how many people are unemployed in this country, what is the kind of policy response you should have on, let's say, manufacturing or services or either? If you don't know how many people are employed in what kind of jobs, how do you adjust, let's say, your industrial policy? if you don't know what your real GDP is in a way that everyone trusts that figure that you put out, then what really is your economic output? Are you making policy for a country that is at whatever, $2,200 per capita GDP? Is it $2,500 per capita, or is it something else completely? So we don't know. I mean, we know, but I'm just saying that there seem to be question marks around that. And having question marks on some of these fundamental issues is always, to me, worrying in itself. Not whether the data is accurate or not. The third is, I think, I would say, is the speed at which we get all of this, right? So I talked about two kinds. One is the big macro data, which affects policy, and there are many more. Okay, the same thing you could take it onto health, healthcare issues, number of hospitals, doctors, number of primary healthcare centers, how many children are getting adequate amount of nutrition. All those data points you also need as you frame policy, whether it's macroeconomic or macro health and so on, or education for that matter. On the other hand, we are also this. If we were to call all of these verticals, now let's look at the horizontal speed. How fast is this information available to you in a manner that you can respond? This is a day and age where we want information quickly. Air quality is another this thing. I cannot wait for 1 week for you to tell me that air quality was this. I need to know at 9 a.m. If I can step out of my house in Vasant Kunj in Delhi or not, or somewhere else. Okay, or is it much better in the evening? Secondly, can I know faster whether there are more variants, and if so, why are those variants where they are? Right? So we've got a beautiful mystery this morning where we've now discovered that there is one of the people in Karnataka who was detected with Omicron is actually not someone who's traveled at all. Right? So what's the next day? And I can think of 10 data questions which could potentially come after that, right? I mean, so where did he get it from? How did he get it? Who was the person he was exposed to? Was he exposed to anyone at all or not? And if not, then where could that virus have come from? So these are all whatever second layer, third layer, and so on. I think the larger point is, and I'm going to stop there. And I know you wanted to talk about innovation, and we'll come to that later. Is about the culture of data. Do we collect data in a way that we feel we should use it to inform ourselves as citizens of this country or of a democratic country? Do we collect data because we genuinely feel that data can empower everyone and not necessarily make me or put me at a disadvantage because obviously it shows me in poor light as a government? Do we collect data because we feel that the more data that there is for everyone, we will all be a happier citizenry? So these are questions. I mean, I don't have any clear answers, but I think that's the point that I think to me matters a lot. That do we have a data culture? I mean, data can be. I mean, you and we were sitting around this virtual table. We may use the word a little loosely. I think what it means to a common person is something different. I mean, is really knowing more about what is happening around him or her on a daily basis, and so therefore. And are we inculcating that as a country? Are we creating more a sense of ownership on data? You need to know this, and this is why this is important. And I'm going to share this with you. Or maybe I'm just dumping a whole bunch of data, which I may be unimportant, but I want you to know. You as a citizen, you deserve to know. So that I think is the most critical thing. And to go back finally to your point about why wasn't maybe let's say more data collected at Nelly, or why don't you trust the data that eventually emerged in terms of the number of people who were killed? And that really comes back to the same point. It is that either we are lax in collecting data, either we are trying to hide something and therefore obviously we are not collecting the data, or maybe we collected it but it's just written on a scrap of paper, which is very likely for that period, and it's lost, or it's not been documented carefully, which brings us to a multitude of other questions about how do you really store data in a way that people can work on it and so on. So I would really stop there. I think the culture of data is what I think is very critical at a very macro level, because it affects all of us, and we need a culture of greater sharing, greater transparency, and appreciation of the need and importance for data and its application in our lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Govinda. Shreya, if there are data gaps, if we know that there are gaps, then why should I trust your story? I mean, because your story then is incomplete. So any policy decision, any conclusion that you're going to draw from incomplete numbers is not going to be a real story. So how does an IndiaSpend, I'm sure, tries to navigate that? So how do you navigate incomplete or unrepresentative data?
Right. So I would say there are several kinds of data gaps, and there's a different approach probably to address all of those. One, of course, is that the data does not exist at all. So, for instance, India at a national level is not collecting learning outcomes of children. It's done by another organization, but nationwide, you don't have that data. So, a journalist's role over there is to actually figure out if there's no data, what can they do to fill that data gap and still bring the story out for people. So then you would visit schools, you would talk to people, you would talk to students, teachers, and try to understand what's happening and get whatever data you can from a micro level. Because that data, of course, if you ask a teacher, they would know what's happening in school. And that's how you fill that particular kind of data gap. That isn't large data, but it still tells you something about what's going on. The other kind of data gap is that the data is being collected, but it's not public. So the government might have it with them, but I don't know about it. The general public doesn't know about it. So then, of course, the journalist's role is to get that data either through RTIs, go to, make those rounds of government offices, try to get it, do what they can to fill that kind of data gap. Also to highlight that that gap exists, even though the data is there. So there's sort of this push for the government to release data. A lot of this, I think, it happened with unemployment data last year when the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey data, did not come out, but came out because of a journalist attempt to get that data, make that data public. So that is another role that the journalist plays. Then there's a situation where, as you say, data is incomplete or it's not reliable. For that, I think a journalist's role over there is to point out where conclusions can be drawn from the data and point out where that lack of quality, lack of reliability is there, and talk to experts, talk to people on the ground to fill those gaps. So I'll give an example of a couple of these. So if you talk about data being there with the government but not being there publicly, this has happened. So India has a law in which mining companies have to pay a certain amount to the local government, which the government then uses for the development of that area. It's called the District Mineral Foundation. Technically, they should have the data of what companies are paying. Or this is a couple of years back. Now I think more data is public. At that point, because there was a law, there should have been data that what is every mining company paying in which district and what's happening to that amount that's coming in. So that data did not exist in 2016. So what we did at IndiaSpend was we chose one of the areas where there was a big problem of silicosis, and people wanted to use the money to take care of people who were affected by mining because they had worked in these mines. So we went there, we went to the local department, and they had the data. They were, of course, they were not unhappy to share it, but they didn't get why anyone would be interested in it. So journalists have to, I think, also bridge that gap between officials understanding that this data is useful beyond their own, own 4 or 5 people department or just the local couple of people who talk to them about it. So we got that data, we made that public, we wrote about what's happening with the money, whether companies are paying up or not. So that's one way to get data out, get more information out. When you talk about learning outcomes, so we've done this where we've used the little bit of data that's available through, of course, Pratham, that does the annual survey on education. But we went to those schools, we went to those particular areas and spoke to teachers and students to understand whether the data is actually reflecting the ground truths and what they think needs to be done to change it. What's actually happening? What effect is that loss of learning having on the ground? So that's another way that journalists use to check data, verify data. In this, another things happen. So, to check the quality of data, India a couple of years back started a new initiative called Shala Siddhi, and they collect a lot of data through it. They made it public at some point. I got some of the data, and then they took it down. What was interesting was when this data was being made available, it was school-wise, and there was the contact detail of the person who had helped fill that form. So journalists can actually call up, check, and find out whether this information was actually given or not. So the government does sometimes put that data out, and I think a lot of it is also on journalists to look for that data. to look for better sources, look for sources to verify that kind of data. So that's another way of doing it. When there's we have a section called data gaps that we run on IndiaSpend, which basically does exactly this. Wherever there's missing data or there's data that's not reliable or incomplete, we try to write about it, bring focus on the problem, and perhaps, people will change the way a survey is done or add more elements to it. For instance, data on transgenders. India does a lot of government, there are a lot of government surveys. There's health, there's stuff on higher education, etc. But the category on transgenders does not exist. Census 2011 had some data, but if you look at the other surveys, it's just not there. So by writing about it, by focusing on the point that, that data doesn't exist, we can demand and ask that, perhaps future surveys collect that data so better policy can be made. We get to know more about certain sections of the population and what they need. So that's another way things are done. Does this help you out in what can the journalist role be? Sorry, I think you're on.
I will be doing. Yeah, thanks, Shreya. Yeah, I'll come back to you.
Sure.
Yeah. To understand, if you can illustrate a little more about how the data gaps are bridged or plugged. But I get your point. I think Govind also makes the point of the culture of data. And I think what you're saying is that we as journalists can actually push the government and the policymakers to give us better data. Granular data. So that is one of the Rukmini, congratulations again on your book. Do you have a copy of the book to hold up to viewers?
I have one single copy and it's not with me right now. I'm sure my publisher will be very upset with me for this.
Okay, no. I mean, I think I love you for that. That's how anyone else would have had 2 copies of theirs. But Rukmini says that I have only 1 copy and it's not with me. Thanks, Rukmini. Now, your book talks about GDP, elections. That's the only area where I saw numbers, and it terrified me because I had a boss who worked with numbers and reams and reams of those copies. I remember Prannoy bringing out and expecting us to mug them up, which I did actually without understanding. But I was very happy to find a section in your book on police crime, because that's an area I have worked on. That's not something that data journalists actually focus. And that's like fundamental. I mean, we are talking about actually human rights issues, day-to-day issues, and the police crime now. But you must have encountered a lot of blind spots out there, right, in police crime. So, can you tell us a little about your book and also about the blind spots?
Sure. So, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be speaking to a university and students who are interested in this, who are interested in data, who are interested potentially in making it better in the fields they take up. So and I'm also very happy to be here with colleagues from IndiaSpend. IndiaSpend has really been the pioneer in this field and continues to provide that platform for data journalists from all over the place. It's really a reliable and innovative home for data journalism. So, and also been a great place personally for me to work as a freelancer as well. So, it's great to be on this panel with both sets of people. A lot of what Shreya just mentioned really talks about bridging the gap between statistics as they are on paper alone and as they operate on the ground, and the role that a journalist can play in providing that bridge. And I think with police statistics, a lot of what I did, what other people are doing and would like to do, sort of picks up on themes that Shreya mentioned. It's a similar sort of ethos, which is that in my case, data came to me second, and being a field reporter came to me first. So seeing the gaps was something that actually happened before I saw the data. I saw the holes before I saw the things that go over it, really. As you would know from having covered any sort of crime or having been in a police station through a night as a reporter, you know how far an FIR is from a statement of fact. And then when you pull back as a data journalist and realize that the very the bedrock of crime statistics in our country, which we use as a proxy for a multitude of things, from safety to a functional or dysfunctional state to the status of women. The thought that it's based on an FIR, which is what the NCRB is a collection of FIRs, is frankly terrifying, because you know the situations in which an FIR is noted down. And in a lot of cases, and again, this is something that IndiaSpend journalists would grapple with every day, which is that that the data is deficient, but that doesn't mean that you can't throw your hands up. You still have to report on it. You need to report on GDP data. You need to report on air quality or on unemployment, despite knowing the flaws with it. So I don't hold it against anyone for having reported NCRB as the basis of crime statistics all this while. What were people to do? But one of the things that happened, I lived in Delhi in 2012, and that period post 2012, when there was this big overdue and very well-deserved public rage about crimes against women. It needed to happen. But I also felt, increasingly worried about the news reporting around it and about the conclusions that we were all beginning to draw from it. What I was seeing was basically uncritical regurgitation of the FIR as news reports. And then I did know that those same FIRs were going into police statistics. And the reporting of it was in terms of this state is more safe, that state is less safe, crimes have gone up so much in this state or the other. So to try and go beyond that, and again, I will say this is not a sort of perfect answer, but it was one way to try and go beyond police statistics. I looked at trials as they were going on in courts, because there's so much more information available then. And one of the things that I ended up finding was that a large share of IPC 376, which is sexual assault, when they were tried in court, they were actually cases filed by 40% were cases filed by parents against consenting young couples, many of them interreligious and intercaste. And you just have to look outside your window at the world around you to know that this is something that will increasingly happen. We are seeing the immense pressure that society is placing on interreligious and intercaste couples right now, and the lengths to which parents and family can go to sort of criminalize the sexual agency of young people in the country. So that is one set of statistics that I looked at, and felt that I was able to at least go slightly beyond police statistics. The other thing that increasingly began to bother me, and this has echoes in COVID and all sorts of things further on, which is that, again, I don't blame a journalist when numbers are put out on a Friday evening. The temptation is not even the temptation. I mean, the sort of majburi is to go with what you have right then, right? Where are these deep resources that you're going to tap into at 7 p.m.? You're going to end up reporting it as is. So when there's interstate comparisons, I would say this for crime and just the same for COVID, you end up reporting, the state that reports the highest numbers is the one that gets the worst headlines, right? You'll say Kerala is the worst state for women, for example, because it reports the highest number of crimes against women. Or you'll say Maharashtra did the worst job of handling COVID, for example. But increasingly what I'm realizing is that in a country with less than complete registration in all areas of that statistics deal with, what we're essentially doing is penalizing states that do the best job of reporting. So it's hard to say anymore whether high numbers are, how much of a high number is about the actual sort of existence of high crime or COVID in a particular state, and how much of it is just that state's ability to have individuals who are empowered enough to report crime, for example, as well as people who are, as well as a machinery that's able to handle these numbers and put them forward. So, I don't have an answer. I don't think that overnight news reporters can stop reporting these numbers as high and low. That's not going to happen overnight. But yes, I do think police statistics point to, say, let me say 2 or 3 things in particular. One is the worrying nexus between officials on the ground, police in this case, and reporters who with uncritical reporting, sort of often, which is in a quid pro quo kind of arrangement, I'll report this from your police station, I'll get some favor from you. We all know that that happens. The great damage that uncritical reporting does is one of the things that police statistics show me. The other thing is what incentives we're creating for states by penalizing them with these headlines, when we report it, interstate comparisons. And the third thing is, yes, to think, as both Govind and Shreya have mentioned, of innovative ways of going beyond the first line of statistics, which, especially if you know through field reporting, is deficient, then you immediately start thinking of innovative other data sources to fill in these gaps.
All right, thanks, Rukmini. I'm going to come back to you for your COVID, coverage, because that was remarkable, and that's probably really will be continuing. I mean, right now it's kind of suspended, right? I mean, the COVID-19.org, but what we are doing after that, as in what is the successor of that, we'll be just coming to that. Ruchira, architect of this panel. You're an economist. I'm told that this is the third wave of economics, right? The data. People, I don't think so, care about numbers. People care about stories. And data can't tell the whole story. So how do you teach data journalism to students, particularly when you have a significant percentage who are like me, who are terrified of numbers? So how do you get across to them and teach them to tell stories with half truths?
So, Krishna, I want to do exactly what Rukmini is saying. Like she says that we want reporters who will report critically. So, of course, I want to start with, how numbers can lead you on the wrong track, how to resolve these issues, how to look at numbers critically. That's what I obviously want to do. But here, the biggest challenge that is there for me is that, while I'm teaching students to be critical, I end up running against this wall where in order to appreciate something, you need a certain reverence for it also. So, I mean, with what's happening with my students is that they're so critical of numbers that they have almost no reverence for it. So it becomes a really strange balance to walk around. But that's what happens, right? So how do I teach data journalism? I have now figured out what I think is a pretty okay formula. I've developed it over years of not years, but 2 years of experience. I've found that if firstly, undergraduate students don't have the tools, and master students who are usually studying journalism, they also do not have the tools because they have not taken an intro to stats class as of yet. So obviously I have to teach tools. But if I have to teach tools, then students will not come to it immediately. They will get bored. I tell them, okay, this is central limit theorem, they're half asleep. So before we go to tools, we have to start with some motivation. So I give them a questionnaire and I ask them, okay, so how would you measure gender discrimination in the workplace? How would you measure housework and childcare? How will you measure emotional labor? How will you measure stress? How will you measure sexism in online gaming? I've come up with these 5 things, mostly from interacting with young people and finding out what they care about. And it's quite interesting because many students think that gender discrimination can be measured. Housework and childcare cannot be measured. Emotional labor cannot be measured. Stress cannot be measured. But sexism in online gaming can be measured. And I have actual, from all the students that I've taught, I've collected stats on how many believe these things can be measured and what cannot be measured. So it's quite interesting how, fewer of them believe that housework and childcare can be measured, whereas cannot be measured, whereas gender discrimination in the workplace can be measured. So I think so this really boils down to the idea of data cultures, and this is the data culture that they're coming from, the idea of what can be and cannot be measured. And of course, when I ask these questions, there are no right answers to these questions, but there are good answers and there are bad answers. That's what I tell the kids, that, okay, guys, there are no wrong answers, but there are good answers and bad answers. And the best answer really to these questions is that everything can be measured. Now, the question is how? And this is where I tell students, this is where you get creative. Now, partly because of the data culture that we belong in, students think that creativity does not really belong in a world in which you're dealing with numbers. In fact, some even come and tell me, ma'am, I'm interested in culture, I'm interested in film, I'm interested in literature, because those things are more creative. Numbers are boring. So I say, all right. But how about I ask you, give me a creative measure to measure for stress. You guys claim you're stressed all the time. Nowadays, that's all my students complain about. They complain that they're stressed. I say, okay, you're stressed. How stressed? Give me a measure. And that is where the creativity comes, developing measures. Google, for instance, came up with the Google Stress Index, where they counted how many people searched for how many people searched for stress relief medication in a particular time frame. And they actually found that, as unemployment levels go up, searches for stress relief medication go up. And of course, that is not a sufficient measure. I mean, I would say if you're searching for stress relief medication, then that's pretty sufficient to indicate that you're stressed, right? Of course, and that would be an underestimate, really. But anyhow, so people think that it doesn't take creativity to work with numbers, but they're wrong, because measuring things that people think cannot be measured takes a good degree of creativity, right? And yeah, from there I go on to tools. Phil Meyer, who many say is, I hate the idea of fathers of data journalism. That sounds firstly so patriarchal, but there it is. Phil Meyer, who many people would say is one of these founding figures who came up with the idea of new precision journalism. He says that data or numbers start to make news if there is variance. So it's not enough for us just to teach mean, median, mode, bar graphs, pie charts, but we have to teach about variance. According to Phil Meyer, the weather in Florida will not make news in the way that weather in Kansas will make news, because it varies. So variances then become a very important part of what I try to do and what I try to teach. However, most human minds do not often understand variance very easily. And while those have higher analytical superiority, often, it's a challenge to get people used to box plots, uncertainty, variances, confidence intervals, right? I also try to get students used to inferential statistics. And this is where I try to create not only a way to look at data critically, but also to look at data with a certain kind of reverence as well. I want them to appreciate the power and the joy of statistics, while of course they are critical of the statistics that they have before them. So I rely then on the central limit theorem, which essentially holds the predictive power of statistics. So it's quite painful sitting through normal distributions, trying to we do experiments in class where we try to demonstrate the central limit theorem, but we try to do that as well. So it's a tough balance, but we try to get that together. And then of course I want them to read journalism, and good quality journalism. I want them to read IndiaSpend regularly. I also try to acquaint them with other journalism projects like Al Jazeera's Broken Homes project, the Panama Papers, the Slave Land, which is about the relation between world trade and labor, the Land Conflict Watch in India. And every year I update my favorites of data journalism projects that I want students to read.
Thanks, Ruchira. Data has been, or data journalism has been for long enough, as long as journalism has been there. Journalism is always with data. I mean, so this new term, data journalism, is like a bit of a buzz. It's just that today we can interpret numbers with various technologies and interpret in different ways. Govind, a quick question to you about the time. You mentioned about that it is time consuming, right, to measure the data, and what Rukmini was saying, that when you are running against the deadline, then how do you bring that data and reflect into a big story? Because news is, I mean, the shelf life on news is so short that by next morning it's something else takes over, and then public memory is gone from that, and the rest of the data crunching that we may do over the next 1 week yields nothing. So that is one. And second, of course, which I wanted you to tell us, is about the public interest innovations in journalism today. I mean, given that this is how I introduced you in the beginning, that you were ahead of the curve. So what would be the public interest innovations in journalism in the 21st century going ahead? Because I mean, you guys may not agree with me, but I think journalism is going through its worst crises. And how do we help as from university? I'm a journalist. I'm first a journalist, then an educator, but as journalists and journalism educators, how do we come together and help the situation?
Yeah. Let me take a slightly what they call a product approach to this. I think maybe journalism is in crisis. Maybe it was always in crisis. I think what people like us try and do is to identify what the need is, and if there is something that's changed in the environment that can help answer that need, right? So in this case, it's data. I mean, I think it was previously referred to as well, as we had the Right to Information Act that clearly created a supply. I mean, that was triggered the first supply of data, which was earlier not so easily available in public domain. That in turn created pressure on governments, whether at federal level, state level, local municipalities, to start generating more data. I don't think that line is as linear as I thought it would be today, but it definitely, if you were to look at it over 15 years, let's say since we had RTI, then I think definitely there is a far greater supply of data today than ever before. So the challenge in some ways is to say, now how do you make sense of all of this? And I think this is similar world over. I mean, if you look at the Freedom of Information Act in the UK and the similar act in the United States, all the countries, though they were, I mean, they were all democracies, started being alive to the issue of data generation or sharing from a government level, at least only recently. So it's a new phenomenon in that sense. The point that Rukmini was making is a little different and is very critical to us. So what she's saying is that basically, how do you write something where you're not sure about source data, or you already know that source data is likely to mislead you if I'm going to do something immediately. So if let's say, let's take air quality again, and if I feel for some reason that all the monitors are not showing the right data, then am I doing the right thing in reporting it? And if so, then what's my next step? But I think the example she used are different. But I think that's a very fundamental issue, and I have no clear answer for that. And maybe I'll lob the ball back into her court for that. But it is, I mean, that is a challenge. So, and how do you convince your readers, right, that okay, I'm not going to give you, let's say, crime data on crime against women right now, though it came yesterday, it was released by the NCRB, because I feel that there is another layer of crunching that I need to do and juxtapose it with other maybe studies or surveys or sample studies before I give you some kind of picture which I think is right. So it's not an easy question to answer, but like I said, let me lob it there. I think on the innovation, I think comes in, and maybe this addresses the sort of challenge of journalism as well. When you're trying to find data which does not even exist, and but you feel that there is a need for. Again, I mean, you could argue that in the case of COVID-19, the COVID-19 is a very live and on the surface issue. It's not something that's being buried, but you could argue that let's say I'm in the city of Mumbai, we're only testing 30, 40,000 people every day, but that's only as many people as are turning up. for various reasons, including travel and maybe some symptomatic conditions and so on. But beyond that, we don't know. And because we're testing only 30,000 people, we are getting 200 positive cases. So are there more? We don't know. Could there be more? We don't know. If they are, then what kind, and could they be the new variant? We don't know. So those are questions that we have to find some other way of answering, even if, let's say, the governmental system or not, I don't think it's fair to say government, let's say the current health infrastructure, private and public, is unable to provide an answer to. In the case of air quality specifically, what we did in 2016-17 was we built our own air quality monitors and installed them around Delhi and in other parts of the country. So at peak, we had almost 65 stations across the country. We built them using low-cost AQI sensors, which were bought at something like $25 a piece. The whole installation came together for about $180 to $200 a piece. And we essentially gave it to friends and others who bought the device and kept it in their balconies in Delhi. And all those monitoring stations also had a GPRS SIM card device and would actually transmitting data real time. So you could actually on a map see what air quality was at a particular point of time in, let's say, Nizamuddin or Vasant Kunj or Greater Kailash or whatever, or wherever we had those monitors. So, and the reason we did that was obviously the frustration that the data was not available. Till then, the Suffered network was just coming up, which is the Government of India's network. But those monitoring stations, like I said, at that time were largely in busy traffic intersections, which so the data was correct, but it was not representative, is at least what we felt. And Delhi Pollution Control Board was, I don't think, had any real-time data to provide. Maybe you could file an RTI and get data going back several months. And contrast to the point that here people are saying that, okay, I want to know what air quality is right now. So that's one instance where I would say there was, I mean, we didn't do the original innovation. I think this was done by a bunch of environmental journalists in other parts of the world, where we've said that, okay, can we combine existing cheap consumer science, consumer level technology, and marry it with some level of, let's say, cloud kind of systems to do this kind of, capturing and generation and transmission of data and so on. So, but every problem may not have a similar solution. Though I generally feel that technology is usually a way to fight some of these data gaps. And but what that technology intervention could be and how we will do it, I'm not sure at this point. In the case of COVID, for instance, I could argue that why is this data not available real time? So let's say 30,000 people samples have been collected in Bombay. Could that data be available more real time to people to understand and dissect rather than with the lag? I mean, so what you get is the headline data. But if I want to go deeper, so the public policy person or the public health person might argue that this data in the hands of people at such an early stage is dangerous, right? And they may be right too. I mean, I'm not sufficiently well versed to fight that battle, but I do feel that it could be done, and there will come a time when someone will start doing it. And so much so that you will know exactly at a point of time how many people, let's say, have been tested positive for COVID in my area. So if I live in, let's say, central Bombay or my part of central Bombay, then I mean, what is the number here right now? Not what it was last week or the week before that. So that could be one way. Air quality I've already illustrated. The same thing you could apply for, let's say, in areas where there is extraction of extraction of iron ore or extractive industries. I mean, it's one thing to say that, okay, there was mining happening here and this was the destruction that happened and all that. But what if we could measure that and watch that more real time? Could it change the way we look at that situation and also our response? So, I mean, there could be any number of examples. I think if you take jobs, for instance, I mean, clearly the government of India's jobs numbers are not being trusted as much. So people are looking at Center for Monitoring Indian Economy and their sample, which in itself is criticized. But the thing is, they are the biggest who are there, who is doing it and doing it and with consistency and regularity. So and that tells you what a huge data gap it is. But at the same time, it also tells you that there are some data gaps only people with scale like governments can fill, and therefore they should. and people like us can only prod and maybe do some mischief once in a way. But otherwise, the real solution lies elsewhere and has to be taken up by those who are entrusted with this task.
Thanks, Govind. And viewers, whoever watching on YouTube, please type in your questions, because soon we will start taking questions from people. Now, Shreya, you talked about RTI, and Govind was also talking about RTI. Our students actually are quite familiar with RTI, because I have to every semester ask them to do at least one investigative piece using RTI. I mean, this costs 10 rupees, and they've kind of, at least some of them, have become familiar. I tried writing when I was working on my books. I've tried, accessing RTI. Book is, of course, a longer time duration, so you can wait for the RTI report to come, but not satisfactory in terms of the numbers of the data that you get. But you got to depend on that, because you don't have access to that. What I wanted to ask you, Shreya, is data. Correct me if I'm wrong. Data generally looks at achievements like number of toilets, Ujjwala scheme, electrification. We don't get the picture of whether people actually are going to have access to those, whether people even need those. I mean, for example, we know that a lot of rural India did not want the toilets, because that was their only time of mobility. Otherwise, and with the toilets, now they're going to be home all the time. So, I mean, I remember doing following Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, and then stumbled on the fact that hundreds of schools across India actually were ghost schools. And then after ghost schools, we found out that they were ghost teachers, and there were salaries going. So the data, of course, was very about achievement. So how do you get past that and figure out the gap there?
Right. So I think data is almost always a starting point. It sort of points you towards the story. For instance, with the whole Swachh Bharat toilet thing, it very, very soon, I think, started becoming clear that even if you were looking at data, toilets wasn't the only data. Water connections was just another data point you could use to see whether, if that particular place has a toilet but no water connection, why, what is that toilet? What purpose is that toilet serving at the end of the day? Is anyone even using it? So the toilet data is just a starting point there. When you talk about something like education, ghost teachers, ghost schools, I think you just start looking at data very, very critically once you know that these gaps are bound to happen in whatever the data set might be, especially in India. And when you start doing that, you start seeing the story change. For instance, if somebody would look at toilets data, the data would be, okay, these number of toilets have grown. But when you know that, okay, there are toilets, but there seems to be an issue because we know that everybody doesn't have water. We know that, toilets doesn't change. They don't change behavior of the people who might be choosing out to go out in the field. And then you just take the story out, you go to the ground, you talk to people, and you figure out what's happening. The other very important thing, I think, is it's just not about using data sets. It's also about understanding research that other people who are much, much more well-versed with data put out. So looking at what researchers are doing, what kinds of relationships they are finding in the data, talking to those researchers, talking to people who look at particular sectors, and then understanding where data can be used and where it cannot be used at all. In terms of RTI, I'd be interested to know how successful these projects have been with the RTI, because increasingly it happens, that you get incomplete information, they push it on, they transfer it, and, and then sort of you need to be very patient and keeping track of it. But I would still say, at least, it's a method of reaching out to the government and putting your request in writing and knowing that you've done that. And there's someone there who's probably seen it. And if it goes to somebody who's actually interested in getting that data, getting to understand the data, they might not send it to you or give you an excuse, but someone somewhere might actually use it or might add it in a future data set or something like that. So I've seen I've also seen that change happen. For instance, I've been covering TB for quite some time. So originally, when drug-resistant TB came out, like people got to know about it in India, and it started increasing the cases of drug-resistant tuberculosis. There was no data on it, of course, and they were not really collecting it separately. And if you would go to the government and ask for it, like without an RTI, they would be very reluctant to say that there were cases because they did not want to accept that this was spreading in the country. But over the years, that changed. It took some time, but now that's just a part of the data that you get on TB. It's just there. But it only happened because someone asked for it initially. So I think it's not just about pointing out the mistakes, but it's also pointing out the fact that people are interested in knowing about these kinds of details. And I still always believe that there's somebody in a government organization, in a department, who is actually interested in what is happening. It's not that everybody's sitting there just to make life difficult for journalists, not send responses in time, but there is somebody there who in their capacity will try and do what they can to help out. So an interesting experience, I had filed an RTI years back in, I believe it was Manipur at that time that had filed this RTI too. And when I called them up, it was a small department. Of course, there was a lot of confusion. My RTI was traveling from table to table. But whenever I would call, they would track whose table it was on. The postman who delivered it called me and told me, I've delivered your RTI to this person at this time. So if you want, you can check on it. So, you find your ways around all of this as journalists.
Yeah. Thanks, Shreya, that you point this out, because, and it's true that people within the system have been whistleblowers in their own way. I mean, journalists don't have access to any other, the information comes from them. The
Right.
biggest stories have come from within the system. People who wanted to change the system. I remember when I was writing my book on encounters, and there was, I can name him, Lieutenant General Huda was the Northern Army commander, a wonderful, erudite general. And there was a friend of mine, an army chap, and we were visiting General Huda's house at Udhampur. And he was nudging me, and he said, you must tell sir that, you're coming out of this book, because he'll feel really hurt and betrayed when it comes out, that you're sitting out here. And, so I told him, and, he's a tall man, loves his drinks in the evening with a cigarette. He got up and he said, and I told him that I'm doing this book, which basically may put the army into a bad light, but that's not the point. The idea is to basically talk about the dirty war. And he got up and he said, you must do it. And, he was very supportive. So, and he was a serving army commander then, to say that, you must do the book. So I'm sure this point that's why I've kind of repeated the point, so that young journalists, if they're watching, should not be entirely cynical about the system, because there are people within that who are going to do that. Rukmini, COVID. Tell us, if you can tell our viewers a story about COVID. I mean, I followed that curve. I followed your podcast. I kept sharing it with the students. But, while you tell us that, also, if you can touch upon how do you humanize data? Because I think that's one of the big challenges of data journalists, right?
Thanks. Yes. So let me talk about the humanized data part first, and then I'll get to COVID. I think one of the important things is to remember what it is that the data set that you're looking at, what does it talk about? Because if it talks about people, for example, there's the leap to humanize it doesn't become that big a leap. If you see these as people whose collective information or behavior or aspirations you're talking about, then that immediately takes that sort of spreadsheet away, and you see the people behind it. Of course, there's no substitute to getting out there and being a reporter. I mean, what is the fun in only sitting behind a spreadsheet? You want to do that too. It's absolutely valuable. I spend most of my day with spreadsheets, but it's not, it's not fun to do that only. So just for the fun of it, I would recommend to all of your students to be out there reporting as much as they can. But of course, it also, and I try not to use the word humanize or even think about it, because it sounds like an artificial act, that it's something that I'm forcing into a news report of, sort of forcing, because it is an aim of the data that I have been told, or an aim of a news story that's important. So I try not to do that. I try to sort of think of the things that either the data sort of misses, falls between the gaps, but that people through their own stories bring to the fore. So there's this. I'm not going to be one of those in my book I say people, but I will say in my book I say that one of the things that I find very striking is how many people in India admit to being against things like intercaste or interreligious marriage in surveys. It's not a hard thing to pick up on. People freely admit to it in surveys, and there's good work done by the economist Payal Hathi, who's looked at surveys in India and surveys in the US, where admitting to sort of being opposed to interracial marriage, for example, is unthinkable. Throughout the last 30 years or so, the share of people who admit to being opposed to interracial marriage has consistently declined to being negligible now. And she makes an important point, which is that this doesn't mean that racism has vanished from the US. We all know that that's very much not the case. But the social norm of it being acceptable to say that to a surveyor has receded. So it's important to think about how these social norms can be changed, even if behavior takes time to change, how the norms can be changed. So in 2013, I was reporting on wheat in Madhya Pradesh, on the wheat harvest and mandis, that sort of thing. It had nothing to do with all of these issues. And there was a Adivasi farmer who had died in line while waiting for over a week because produce was not being picked up, and in a line of trucks at the mandi he had died waiting in line. So in the course of my news reporting, I tracked down his son, who lived in a his family lived in a distant area, and I went to meet them. And a local reporter for a Hindi newspaper asked if he could come along with me and he would report on it as well. And among this from reporting, the generosity of people you meet on the field is absolutely unmatched. So this poor grieving man got milk and sugar from a neighbor's house, made me tea. You know how common this is. And when I was leaving, he dug up sweet potatoes from his own field and handed them to me, and I left in the car. But this colleague of mine from the Hindi newspaper had not had anything. And as soon as the car sort of moved out of the settlement, he told the driver, take me to a tea shop. I'm just desperate for a cup of tea. So I asked him why he hadn't had it there. I thought he was full, and he said, I'm a Brahmin, so I can't eat from a Adivasi person's house. So after that, he took me to his own house, because he wanted to introduce me to his daughter. He thought that I would be an example of a working woman that he should show his daughter. And I told his daughter this, that he had not taken a cup of tea from this man's house. So she rounded on him and shouted at him and said, I told you that even if you are going to do these things, you can't say it outside. So it was exactly this sort of social norm that she was trying to enforce on him, that I know you have casteist attitudes, but at least change what you feel free to admit saying out there. So, it really struck me as this being sort of the research I was referring to earlier. This is how it sort of plays out in the ground. I'm going to just, before I talk about COVID, I just want to mention a couple of things that have been mentioned earlier. One is Ruchira's point about, inculcating a reverence for data. I don't know, and I know, reverence is not what either of us are talking about, but this sort of value that there is good data as well. And I would really sort of second your point and strongly want to convince your students that there is a lot of great value in Indian data. The reason that it's worth saving and fighting to protect is because there is so much of value that it can tell you. It's actually staggering the amount of detail that we do get from Indian data. Of course, there's a lot that it doesn't ask. It's not high frequency enough. The frequency point that Govind mentioned is really one of the fundamental deficiencies now, and why we're turning to private data sets. But yes, I would sort of add to your point that most of the key things that we know about this country come from our official data system, which is a truly impressive edifice. It came in the 50s and it grew in the 50s. We were the envy of the developing world in setting up something that was far beyond our level of development at the time. It was an ambitious and sort of inspiring enterprise that produces a wealth of information. So yes, I feel very passionate about official data despite its deficiencies. And I would like to share that, because only when you feel it's valuable, you feel it's worth saving. Otherwise, so what if household surveys don't get released anymore? Anyway, they don't tell us anything. That's not true. They tell us all of the most important things that we know about the country, which is why they are worth saving, which is why a situation which happened last year in which a household consumption survey was just not released because the government claimed that it wasn't good enough is unacceptable. It had never happened. And the fact that we as a nation, as democratic participants in this process have allowed that to happen is so I feel ashamed about it, that it happened in our watch, that for the first time ever, a household consumption survey could be suppressed. It's truly shameful that happened. I'm just going to segue to COVID from here, not a good segue, because COVID is not one of the cases in which our official data has come out shining. Though let me say that this is both true and untrue, which is that, and it touches upon the point that Govind made about what do you do when data is not good enough, and do you trust people to run with that data. So I'll talk about two things on COVID data very quickly. One is to do with excess mortality, which is something that a number of journalists, including many from the Hindu and I and others, worked on. And the issue was here that we know that the official death toll was missing a lot of people. So what is another way you can go about it? Let's look at deaths from all causes in normal years and in pandemic years. Let's look at the gap between the two and raise questions about whether a lot of this gap is COVID. That's the sort of premise of it. So this is a case in which I was first very surprised by how far Indian statistics have come, because the civil registration system, which all of us are used to seeing as a PDF, 2 years after the fact, is now almost fully digitized, even in states like Bihar. Of course, there's a lot lacking in Bihar. For example, only 50% of deaths are registered even now, but it is all digitized and real time. You can see deaths registered, every day, and it's available across state portals across the country. However, it's not public. And I do understand that, that there are levels of information or sort of understanding needed before you can run with this data. So for example, registrations are improving. The registration processes are getting stronger. So is a simple increase, is it an improvement of the registration process, or is it an increase in deaths? That's a fair point to make. Of course, when the numbers spike, 5 and 10 and 15 times in one single month, we know that, registrations didn't shoot up in May 2021 for no apparent reason. That's not what happened. But yeah, so here is where Indian data has improved greatly. Then it is still behind sort of closed doors, and we should be, again, raising the democratic pressure for that data to be made public. I do believe that saying that this data should be made public and then putting the onus of sort of nuanced explanation should be put on our media and academics and other people. I don't think it's a good enough reason to not have this data public. You can have 10 pages of caveats under it and still have this information public, particularly when there's a public interest or an emergency need, as there is for it right now. Let me just briefly talk about COVID-19India.org. I was not part of COVID-19India.org, but I am part of a group that, which is one of many groups that have tried to extend the fantastic work that that team did. It was an entirely, COVID-19India.org was an entirely volunteer-run completely pro bono, anonymous effort by just a group of public spirited young people who worked incredibly hard to put together this public resource that is a collection of official data sources. That's the frustrating part. It isn't that they, devised sort of unusual sources. These were all government Twitter handles, Facebook pages, but that the government itself was not collating, is not collating even now. So yes, since they were winding up operations in October, by the end of October this year, several groups have come together to sort of replicate their work and continue it in the same way. Ours is called COVID19bharat.org, and it's up and running, so free for people to use in exactly the same format as earlier, of course, with some initial glitches. But I will just say one thing which touches on both the innovation point and sort of democratic points. I have struggled with the question of whether a resource like this is a good or a bad idea. I mean, this seems like an uncritical, this seems like something that shouldn't be up for question. Of course, it's a good thing. But what bothers me is that the more we sort of bootstrap innovative solutions, the less democratic pressure we put on governments to produce data that they should be producing. There are areas in which we need to come up with innovative solutions. But the literal number of daily reported, recovered, confirmed deaths that were produced by the government itself, collecting them and putting them out, I don't think it should have been a sort of volunteer-driven effort as it is even now. And what if none of us had decided to take the baton from this group and there had been absolutely no data? Maybe there would have been an uproar in parliament with nobody able to see any numbers. Would that have put some pressure? I don't know. I don't have, and I have chosen not to do that, to go with the solution that does produce the numbers. But yes, I do worry about lowering the tone or sort of lowering the volume on just how much we require the government to put out data that should be put out by right. That's not sort of unusual or sort of minor data. I'll stop here.
Thanks. We have like some 15 minutes and there are a couple of questions from the audience. So we'll quickly go through the questions. I'll throw them. I will choose who will speak because they haven't indicated in their questions who will speak. So Ruchira, I'll start with you. Someone in the audience says that how do economists, data journalists, and researchers work with and get hold of data?
Well, I mean, there are a number of publicly available sources. So at least, like just as a good example of what we do in our classes, in the first batch that I taught, we worked with American Time Use survey data. That's partly because I was trying to create, the idea that data is a good thing, it's worth preserving, it can give you results. So ATUS is amazing. And, that should be a model that we can replicate. I think CMI is trying to do that in part, high frequency, high collection, and it gives you data on time spent combing your hair, time spent cooking your dinner, that kind of granular data. So yeah, that's what we did in our first year. The second year that I taught, we used the periodic labor force survey data, which actually had been leaked at that time through the Business Standard Project. So we used that, and I also tried to get students to work with a public Indian data set and see what kind of results they could get out of it. The next year we've used the COVID19India.org data till using the API till 31st October. So we haven't worked on the new COVID19bharat.org data yet. And students made posters, they made, they wrote stories. What they've even contacted, I believe some of them might have contacted Rukmini. They contacted other journalists like Srinivas and Ramani, and try to find out stories that they were doing, which they could then substantiate with their data work. So there are a lot of publicly available data sources available that that students and those of us who are professionals can also work with. Also, you can collect, but that takes money, that takes resources, and that's also part of our data culture, that we create a culture of supporting data projects, or also creating and making data sources available to more people in an open way, open government projects, RTIs, that way.
Govind, student of ours, Tushar, was asking this question, that sometimes data alone is not enough to tackle fake news and misinformation. In such scenarios, how does one change public perception even when strong data fails to have an impact?
I think you should put this question to my other two colleagues on the panel as well. I think broadly, we are in a different era right now. I mean, that people will not believe many things even if it is sort of blatantly proved to them. So let me give you an example from elsewhere. It was on several occasions people were told that Donald Trump was not blessed by the Pope to become president of the United States in 2016. But people said that that's not true. He was blessed, right? Because they believed it. I mean, it's an alternate reality or whatever you want to call it. People were equally could not be convinced that Hillary Clinton was a witch. I mean, they felt that she was a witch and therefore she did not deserve to become president. Right now, as we speak, there are people who are waiting for JFK Jr., I think, to turn up in Texas for I think I don't remember the exact chain, but he's supposed to turn up and then he'll go and become president, or he'll join Donald Trump in becoming president. There are people camped out there. So there are many, and there are many more in varying degrees of comprehension, I think, who will either believe or not believe, and there's sometimes very little you can do about it. But that doesn't mean that we stop trying. I think there is a middle layer of people who will obviously be convinced with some data, and thankfully they exist, and because they exist, people like us exist. But let me throw this to Rukmini and Shreya as well. I think they might be able to give better examples.
Yes, Shreya and Rukmini, I mean, open to you. I mean, the same person was asking the question. I think we've already dealt with that question. That is data better at providing the full picture? But Shreya had already mentioned that data is a starting point, and you are taking the story forward. But yeah, if you have any takes on that, I have a couple of other questions. But Shreya and Rukmini, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, why don't you take this, because you would know more on fact checking.
Right. So I actually am on that side where I believe that there are certain people who, the people who are on the fence are the ones that you're actually targeting, honestly. The people who are already convinced of some misinformation, no matter what you bring to the table, they're not going to get convinced whether there's data or not. It's the people who are on the fence and the people who are sort of not sure what's true are the ones you're aiming for. And they're the ones who will tend to get convinced by data more than just, by somebody giving the other side.
Sorry. Let me throw this question to Rukmini. Someone's asked that how better data could help prevent custodial deaths. Is there a way?
Well, I mean, multiple things. One is, I don't know if data is what's lacking in this. I do think that we have not, I'm sorry, I don't have a data-based answer, but when we still have a sort of broad culture in which the custodial deaths or encounter deaths of people who are quote unquote sort of public enemy number one at the moment because of some gruesome crime that has happened, when there is sort of wide cheering of that, we're going to be very far from a place in which we can reduce custodial deaths. I mean, this is something we've seen in Assam right now, which is, it's perfectly okay to cheer custodial deaths as a serving cop, as a serving chief minister, and we failed in creating a culture in which the norm is the norm, and that particular crime doesn't matter. I consistently had a problem with the way crimes are reported in India, the norms for the media in terms of what is permissible, and I really think one of the sort of ways we need to have norms that work is that you test these against what is, again, quote unquote, the worst sort of crime. If you think it's permissible to talk about to report on the accused in the 2012 Delhi assault in any sort of manner that sort of defies all laws, then you're not going to have norms set. We're not going to be able to set norms only when we like the accused, So I'm sure better data can help in these conversations, but we're really starting from a terrible position. We're starting from a position where it's perfectly okay to cheer custodial deaths if you've decided that you don't like the face or the religion of the person who's been killed. So yeah. Data can take steps. It can't make these enormous societal leaps that we need to take right now.
And you were talking about the data available in the public domain, and I remember whenever we used to run out of stories and get terribly anxious that the third day in a row that I haven't got a story, what do I do? And then you pick up the CAG annual report, and I always felt that had a treasure trove of stories actually lying out there. That was my go-to place for doing those bread and butter stories that often turned out to be actually interesting stories that we followed. It had a lot of data, good data, but there will be good data, there will be data gaps, there will be insufficient, incomplete data, and but I think the whole story is not going to be told only through data. It has to be done, the data, and of course, the field journalism, field work. That's you can't quite divorce that from the data stories. I'm the audience, so there is just about 5 minutes left. If you have any last questions, you can ask. But if I can again, since we are also celebrating Rukmini's book, if I ask Rukmini to tell us what can data tell us about modern India, Rukmini, that we don't know.
I'm going to answer in 1 minute instead of 384 pages, which is what the book is. As I said, when I was talking about Ruchira's point earlier as well, it's actually, I enjoyed working on the book in reminding myself of the wealth of what data can tell us about, the minutiae of people's lives, how much salt someone eats, the average person in one state eats rather than the other, as well as the big picture sort of questions. I do want to make sure that I don't have a sort of uncritical reverence for official data, and this comes from, we've seen extraordinary news reporting in the last couple of years. We've seen excellent news reporting from Pramit Bhattacharya of Mint, for example, on the the new GDP series. So there are broader crises, but I feel good about what data journalism has done in the last couple of years. So let me say that what I feel that data can tell us about modern India is both a combination of big picture stories and the minutiae of people's lives, as well as point us in directions that that we sometimes in bubbles might tend to miss. And this is particularly why I appreciate having national data that is truly national and representative. Things like the sort of enduring hold of caste over everything from decisions taken on matrimonial websites to jobs to salaries is something that people on Twitter might not feel is such an enduring issue, but large data sets both from the government and from a couple of private agencies point us in those directions. So I'd say some of the things that we feel we've left in the past or that belong only to corners of the country are actually very much the mainstream. It's good to remind myself of how much of the periphery or the sort of 1% I belong to, and Indian data can be humbling in that respect.
Thanks, Rukmini. And Ruchira, let you wrap it up before I say thanks to everyone. When Ruchira came to JSJC, I remember saying that we need to do data journalism, and that's partly because I don't know how to crunch data, and I've lived through newsrooms several years, and I know how that's a huge inadequacy. I think we've gone through our lifetime without knowing that, but I don't think the future journalists should or will be able to go through. I mean, they should know, just like we need to know how to read judgments, however obscure they sound. Similarly, I think numbers are, may sound a little terrifying, look a little terrifying. Spreadsheets, I shall still not get over spreadsheets. I think the design of spreadsheets should be more humanized, Rukmini. They look totally alien to me. But that's a design fault, let's say, not the fault of the numbers. So Ruchira, what are we going to do with IndiaSpend and JSJC? I mean, what are the things that you have in mind?
We are going to learn from IndiaSpend. I think that's one of the most important things for us as educators. Education starts to lag behind industry and no longer can meet the needs of the media and of the industry unless we learn from what is happening in industry. Innovation, of course, happens through both. It happens through educators. It also happens through the media, through the industry. But we need to work together. So essentially, that's why this MOU is so cool. That's where we are going with it. We want our students to follow IndiaSpend carefully. We want to follow IndiaSpend carefully ourselves. Also, we are hoping for an exchange of ideas. I mean, I know we are teaching undergraduates, but any reporter who wants to attend my classes, you are most welcome. That's what the MOU allows. I'm happy to give as much of my own services whenever required to do anything, really, because I want to learn on the job. So that's where we're going with that. Our students will benefit immensely because they will get, because they will go for internships. And I've told IndiaSpend internships aren't just go get coffee, but sit down and learn stuff. I mean, Govindraj might come back to me on that. So I mean, I'm very excited for our students, and I'm very excited for our future as a collaboration.
Thanks so much. In the summer, I had got some students together because they wanted to do some project on COVID, and I said, okay, let's do some data journalism work and find out how COVID was covered in the media, and not just in English language media, but in the language media across the country. But we selected 10 states, and they did I thought, a very impressive job, except after collecting, they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't want to. I tried to push them, but I think that's the wall, you see. So it's not just collecting the information, but then what you do with that information. They're suddenly, they're overwhelmed with so much of information which they collected. We still have that information with us, and we collected the information on the second wave. So during the second wave, how media covered it, and no surprises, it wasn't covered because most of the media organizations had COVID trackers. So it was the same information that was getting. So we picked up, say for example, Himachal Pradesh or Rajasthan. So it was only just like one city, and not even the entire city that was getting covered. So that way, I think the coverage has not been adequate. I don't know, y'all would be in the know of this better, but I will, as your timekeeper, thank you so much, Govind, Rukmini, Shreya, Ruchira, for sparing your time. The viewers for watching, listening to us, please write in, please join, please contribute public service journalism, because that's what, and we need viewers, we need listeners, we need supporters. I don't think it's journalism otherwise, and we are not going to give up. I think that's the bottom line, that we need to create a culture of data. I think that success is going to be the day the word data from journalism goes away, because as Steve Joyce says, that the most important word in data journalism is journalism. And so we should not, data should be just part of journalism. It shouldn't be a separate entity, data journalism. So thank you so much. See you again.
Thank you. All the best, Rukmini. Look forward to your book.
Bye.
And guys, please go out and pre-order it online and go to the store and buy it and gift it. It's a good Christmas gift. During Christmas, you're supposed to gift books, not
support IndiaSpend. support public spirited journalism.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.